means.
Should they get an Iron Dome too, the Palestinians?
Well, let's talk about that as a conversation.
Well,
I mean,
you know what's in the air, you know what's in the air, you know what's in the air, you know what's in the air. It's possibility, it's possibility, it's possibility, it's possibility.
All right, so Emma Vigeland and Matt Bernstein did an interview with Mallory McMorrow. This is the opponent, one of the opponents of Abdul El-Sayed in Michigan. So he is running for a Senate seat, and this is currently a three-way primary. Three candidates that are pretty much neck and neck. One of them is floated by AIPAC entirely. This other one, Mallory McMorrow, is a little bit more of the middling candidate, especially when it comes to Israel, which we're going to see in a few minutes. And Abdul El-Sayed is the Medicare for All, fully cutting off aid to Israel, no ifs, ands, or buts type of candidate. So that's the dynamic that we're seeing in a lot of races. Mallory McMorrow has done like a spur of interviews trying to, I guess, reach out a little bit to the left. Now, this interview was a little controversial. She at first wanted to go on this show, but then I guess backed out after, according to Matt, he told her that they would be talking about healthcare and foreign policy. So suddenly they said they didn't want to do it anymore. Then Matt kind of blasted them on Twitter, and so all of a sudden her comms people changed their mind, reached out again. So now this interview happened. So he then, in a gift to Emma Vigeland, got her on the interview, and so they got to go hard together against Mallory McMorrow in this. I know Emma was probably chomping at the bit. It was a very contentious interview, maybe not flawless in execution, but I think they did the job, which is to really thoroughly put McMorrow under a microscope when it comes to the issue of healthcare and Israel. So here's the first part where they're talking about Medicare for All, and they ask her about this clip that Sam Seder has been bringing up over and over on his show, where she says you can't do a system like Medicare for All because that would mean somebody like Donald Trump could end up controlling it.
Some people conflate Medicare for All with universal health care. But Medicare for All, when it's actually defined, is one singular government-run healthcare system that we are all on. Now, I want you to imagine what that would look like with Donald Trump and RFK Jr. at the head of it.
Emma, do you want to take this?
Yeah, sure. So State Senator McMorrow, it feels like the implication of your framing there is that government healthcare programs shouldn't be trusted because Trump and RFK Jr. are leading them. Are there other programs, specifically healthcare programs or social programs, you think should be cut because Trump and RFK Jr. are currently in charge of them?
No, that's not at all what I intended. And, why fundamentally and firmly believe that we need access to universal health care. We need to get there as quickly as possible. In the state Senate, I have led on efforts to codify the Affordable Care Act on the state level so you can't lose your health. Having that real public option, anybody who wants to opt into Medicare, regardless of age, can, while also ensuring if you want to keep your plan through your union or through your employer that you can, I believe, is the best way that we can get to universal health care as quickly as possible.
We can talk about, I think, the merits of the public option versus Medicare for All, but the public option would still be run by Donald Trump and RFK Jr. or whoever ends up being a Republican if they take over. So, additionally, the entire Republican Party is against Medicare for All and single payer. So it's almost an assertion that Democrats shouldn't pursue Medicare for All or even single payer because potentially Republicans could get back into power and control it. I mean, that is the implication of what you said.
I don't think that it is. I think that's a mischaracterization.
How would you characterize it then?
You talk a lot on the trail and you want to make some jokes and you want to help people understand where you're coming from.
And, another part of your assertion was that Medicare for All is, I wrote the quote down, one singular government-run healthcare system that we're all on. Can you elaborate on that? Because Medicare for All is a replacement for private insurance with a single government payer, like Medicare is currently. It's not government-run healthcare.
Sure, you're right. And I have taken that feedback to heart. We campaign a lot. And I do talk about this differently now so that it doesn't come across as
Yeah, so I know Emma was psyched she got to ask McMorrow about that because, like I said, Sam Seder has been bringing that up over and over again. This idea that Medicare for All is a bad idea because Republicans could at some point control it. And that is something that seems to have some purchase with the base and possibly is an effective effective fear-mongering tactic, but you could also apply that to any service that the government might administer. So it's kind of an argument against the concept of expanding government services in general. And so she says she thinks that's an unfair characterization and doesn't support cutting things like that. And they, sometimes you like to tell little jokes on the trail. But she didn't have that much better of an answer for it because in her view, and this is similar to what we got from like Buttigieg in the primary that he ran and other Democratic candidates, is that it's better to go with the incremental approach, fighting on every front that you can. And in her view, creating a public option, which would then compete with other private options so that people don't have to lose the healthcare options they have right now if they like those. That was the exact argument that we got from Buttigieg, was Medicare for all who want it. But ultimately, Medicare for all is just wiping out the insurance industry overall and letting the government do the insurance part, not the administering of healthcare part. And so forcing McMorrow to clarify that and getting her to walk that back, I think it was a good move. I'm sure Sam is psyched that that went down that way, and she deserved to have somebody check her on that, because I'm sure that it hasn't been brought up except maybe in some, more granular case on the campaign. So for the rest of this interview, pretty much the rest of the entire time, they talk about Israel. And I think that's good because they press her in a number of good moments and get not really substantive answers. They get a lot of waffling out her. Really, the reason the segment takes so long is because she goes on at length about some of these issues, but doesn't really give, great or firm answers on any of it, which I think does, kind of accomplish the goal of examining what this candidate's ideas are on Israel. However, I think maybe there could have been more of a focus on, the broader range of issues. Maybe the over focus on Israel in this interview could have come off a little bit myopic, or could, end up scoring points in her favor if she seems like she's the underdog or on the back foot or being unfairly ganged up on. It was quite a contentious interview. But I think, Emma Vigeland is not there to hide the fact that she is supportive of a candidate that is out there campaigning for Medicare for all and bold decisions on foreign policy like Israel. And so that's an interesting dynamic that we'll get into after these clips. This is them pressing McMorrow on her stances on aid to Israel, etc.
So I wanted to highlight your approach and ask you about it. On your website, you write, quote, "The path to lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians lies in a two-state solution, with a democratic Jewish state of Israel existing safely along a democratic Palestinian state." You also support funding for Israel's defensive weapons infrastructure, things like the Iron Dome. Is that all correct?
Increasingly, that's changed.
Okay.
So I would support Israel continuing to be able to purchase systems like the Iron Dome, defensive systems. But I think it's in the best interest of the United States in reducing that aid and allowing Israel to do that on their own.
The Iron Dome allows Israel, one might say, to operate with impunity because they don't face the same threat of retaliation. So what would you say to that?
I hear you. As you can imagine, this is a conversation we have every single day in a state like ours. I will always, my pledge is to always be objective. I am not so tied to an individual viewpoint that I'm not willing to change my mind when the facts on the ground change.
I guess then to that end, why do you support funding to Israel's defense infrastructure? What is, I guess, sort of your positive vision in supporting that policy? You know what I mean?
Because I don't think anybody should live in fear of being bombed or killed. I would look at, how do we support defensive systems for Palestinians? How would we support defensive systems for Lebanese?
Should they get an Iron Dome too, the Palestinians?
Well, let's talk about that as a conversation.
Well,
I mean, the horror of living in fear of being bombed constantly. Let's work with the outcome of, how do we end the violence, period.
But
then backing away from that, how do we protect people?
I think then, though, that sort of probes at, maybe we're coming from different worldviews here a little bit, because my worldview, and I think one that Emma has been talking about as well, is multiculturalism, where we live amongst each other and where multiculturalism and a respect for one another keeps us safe. Do you believe Israel has committed and is committing a genocide?
Yeah, we went through this on our campaign. Based on the legal definition, I've said this, I do believe that it meets the definition. What I also heard in response from many of my constituents who had family that they lost in the Holocaust is there is such a personal, visceral reaction to that word that moves us apart from each other.
I think that the definition is important because of international law, and we're seeing right now the Trump administration and, frankly, the Biden administration was also a part of the degradation of international law and the rules-based international order. And, you know, there was a Quinnipiac poll from August 2025. This has probably increased since then, that 77% of Democrats, over half of independents, believe that Israel is committing genocide. Don't you think that it's important to articulate that just to support international law at a time when the foreign policy of the United States, and by extension Israel, is might makes right?
I think it is important to listen to everybody that I would be asking for faith and trust to represent, and to build the coalition that we need to hit the same goals. There is no doubt that war crimes have been committed. There is no doubt that the pain and suffering at the vast expense of our taxpayer dollars, Matt, to your point, that we continue to pay for this, needs to end. And I want to keep my people together at a moment when so much of the emphasis is on how to tear them apart.
Yeah, but you also have groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the Israeli organization itself, B'Tselem, calling it a genocide. So I read that out just because I think that when we're talking about how to keep a coalition together, the 77% of Democrats that think Israel's committing genocide, the 90% of Democrats that have a negative view of Israel or don't want to send them more money, that would, I would imagine, be the position that would be as unifying as possible, because it appears like this is kind of a consensus opinion now within the Democratic base.
I mean, I hear that it's reflective in polls, and reading polls and asserting how campaigns should be run based off of polls is not a way that you win in a state like ours. And Matt, I hear that you don't want to talk about
polls and morality, both polls and international law and morality.
And talking about morality, Trump put out an AI-generated video of Trump Gaza.
Yeah, so this is really the heart of the discussion here. Another thing that they talk about a lot is like two-state solution versus one-state solution, and that's how you get this moment where they're asking about defensive spending for Israel, and she's saying, well, I don't think anybody should be getting bombed, so, you know, we should be talking about defensive spending for Palestinians. And Emma, as a joke, says, should they get an Iron Dome as well? And Mallory McMorrow says, we should talk about that. So we're talking about funding defensive Iron Domes for two countries so that they can continue doing asymmetric warfare with one another and keep funding the one that is ultimately still more powerful. That's the type of vision that you're getting from like the standard Democratic brand. So even though somebody like McMorrow isn't like the worst in the world and is, you know, further distance from AIPAC than their other opponent, Stevens, still, there's this lack of imagination about like where it's possible to go from here. However, aside from the two-state versus one-state solution, which, like I said, they did pull her into a long conversation about that, which is, I think, a fine thing to do because it's good to put her under a microscope about it. But she kind of makes a point that that's not so much the job of a senator, which is true. However, I've heard the point made recently that, like, I think it was Matt Leck that said, you know, these people are lawmakers. So it's not really appropriate for them to kind of demur on this issue of whether things are illegal or not, or what the legal solution should be. However, when it comes to, you know, drawing the actual borders or what the one state versus two state solution looks like in Israel, I do think that's maybe an over focus on that could be something that it's a little bit too easy for her to say, I'm focusing on different issues than that. However, it seems like a lot of voters are not buying that. And a lot of voters genuinely do want answers to those questions over conversations about like more kitchen table politics, as they normally call it, because the issue of Israel is a good litmus test, not just like for your morality of how you stand, where you stand on this issue, but also like how far are you going to go to buck the system? Are you willing to stake your political career on this idea of cutting off aid to Israel because you believe that's the right thing to do. And I think right now you're seeing that people want that type of moral clarity, and they understand that there are other issues at play and healthcare and other things, that are even more detailed and less politically attention grabbing than that are still important. But at the same time, how you would approach a very complicated and seemingly distant issue like America's relationship to Israel is actually very important to people who are going to be voting for their senator. And in this talk about defensive spending versus offensive spending, yada, yada, this idea that Israel should still be able to buy weapons, or, oh, my position is starting to change on that. So you're still getting waffling on this idea of defensive spending. But really, it's just interesting to see. It's kind of natural that Democrats who do not want to relent on positions like that, like fully unwinding all military support for Israel, they're going to try to retreat to certain positions like, well, I don't think that they should be able to have offensive weapons, but of course they should be able to defend themselves. Well, okay, that's not playing well anymore either. Well, I'm kind of changing my position on that. Maybe you're right. Maybe that is the same as offensive spending. So what that means is that in the popular mindset, at least as it seems right now, the idea that America should be supporting and upholding the project of Israel is kind of collapsing. And so that's why a candidate like Abdul El-Sayed is able to outflank and to kind of rise in the polls, as well as Zohran Mamdani, because people are seeing how this is attached to our politics. And there is a growing narrative in the minds of people across the political spectrum that our money, our taxpayer money, is going to not just bombing children on behalf of Israel, but building the Israel project and building out these settler outposts that then get folded into the greater Israel project and just become territory of Israel. People are seeing that and seeing how that implicates the United States and seem to want representatives that can speak clearly about that. So, like I said, this race is neck and neck, and we'll see. There's a lot of pressure to get Mallory McMorrow to drop out in favor of like the establishment run against Abdul El-Sayed, because he has momentum, and so there needs to be that coalescing of the establishment vote in order to stop him, which very well could be successful. I think Stevens is mostly floated by money. She's the AIPAC candidate, and she's the one who's stumbled a lot throughout this race, but has consistently had the money to keep her going, whereas Abdul El-Sayed and Mallory McMorrow have been doing a lot of small dollar fundraising and being very competitive on that end. So we'll see. I think that the grassroots positions of El-Sayed are going to ultimately be the more persuasive argument, but there's a lot of dynamics in this race, and I think Mallory McMorrow, she's talking about this issue the exact same way that Kamala Harris was, or that we've heard from other Democrats like Pete Buttigieg. He did an interview about this and got a ton of backlash, because it's this endless waffling and wanting to talk about how complicated the situation is rather than being willing to take a very strong stance on it. People want to avoid taking a strong stance on it and say, well, that's not so much what the American people are worried about. But no, actually it is. And your ability to take a strong stance on that is the indicator for not just like, are you someone who has moral clarity, but like, are you somebody who's a real person who is thinking for yourself and coming to a conclusion about this rather than just being a cipher for all the different things you're hearing? And that's kind of what you get from Mallory McMorrow throughout this interview, is she's trying to balance all these different perspectives. And specifically on the issue of Israel, it seems like the balances are tipping very heavily on that. So we will see on August 4th and in all the time leading up to that, how much that's going to decide what happens in this particular election.